Hello and welcome to my school channel. My name is Angela, and in this video we're going to continue the government topic by topic video lesson. So in this video we're moving on to the topic constitutional developments, the pre-independence era. So here we're going to discuss the first four constitutions that were created in Nigeria. These constitutions were created before Nigeria's independence in 1960. So I've divided these video lessons into two parts. The first part, we're going to discuss the first two constitutions, the Clifford and the Richards, and in the second, we will discuss the Macpherson and the Littleton Constitution. Please stay with us, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to my school channel. Like I said earlier, we're going to begin with the first segment of the video. We're going to discuss the Clifford and the Richards Constitution. So let's dive right into it. So here is a list of things that we're going to discuss. So we're going to do a recap of British colonial administration, especially here in Nigeria. We're going to discuss the Crown Colony system, the Nigerian Council. Then we're going to begin with the Clifford Constitution. Then we'll move on to the proposed Bourdillon Constitution of 1939, the Richards Constitution, so many different conferences that went on in between these constitutions. We're also going to discuss the Macpherson and the Littleton Constitution. So let's begin with a definition of the Constitution. So in the previous video lesson, we discussed the Constitution and the various types of Constitution we have. So we defined the Constitution as a collection of norms or standards that govern a country. So it consists of agreed upon rules and principles that define the allocation and exercise of governing powers within a nation. So a constitution is a very important document within a society because it helps to guide how the governments act, the functions that they have, the powers that they have, so that they do not go above the law and they do not abuse the rights of the citizens. So that's why a constitution exists within a society. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we also discussed two different types of constitution based on the method in which it was written. So we have the written constitution and the unwritten constitution. So an example of a written constitution is the one we have here in Nigeria. All of the constitutions that were developed here in Nigeria were written. So these are opposed to the unwritten constitution that was adopted in the United Kingdom. So a constitution is important because it ensures law and order by establishing the rule of law. This is very important in a society. There has to be a body of documents that contains the laws within society, and it has to be established that these laws are above everyone in society regardless of their status or the power that they hold within that society. So it also defines how power is distributed among the various branches of government. We've discussed separation of power and checks and balances and how it is important within a society. So the Constitution also defines the power that is allocated to each of the different branches of government, the legislature, executive, and judiciary. So it also protects the rights and freedoms of individuals. It helps to ensure that the power that has been given to these different branches of government are not abused, so much so that it infringes on the rights of the individuals within that society. So the Constitution also outlines the rights and the liberties of the citizens to ensure that they are not abused. So it also provides a framework for resolving conflicts. So whenever there are conflicts within society, the judiciary always refer back to the Constitution to determine how judgment should be made on different cases. So in the Nigerian context, constitutional development represents the gradual movement from authoritarian colonial rule to participatory self-government and eventual independence in 1960. So discussing the constitutional development of Nigeria is important because we begin to understand how so many of the different rules that we have in our society now were created. So we're going to begin this journey through our constitutional developments from right before independence, when the British were still colonizing the Nigerian people. So they made several different constitutions during the pre-independence era that helped to govern the society. So that's what we're going to focus on in this particular topic. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss a recap of colonial administration here in Nigeria. So we understand that at the beginning, the British people had a relationship with Nigeria by settling in the ports of Lagos and all other places close to the Atlantic Ocean, and they were trading with traders from different parts of Nigeria. That's how they first came into contact with the Nigerian people. But colonial administration actually began with the annexation of Lagos in 1861. So the British annexed Lagos in August 1861 through the Treaty of Cession, signed by Obadosumo and British representatives. So that's when colonial administration began, when Obadosumo signed a Treaty of Cession with the British authorities. So the stated goal was to end the transatlantic slave trade and to establish legitimate trade within the country. Before then, people were being sold to the British and other European traders so that they can transport them to other parts of the world to work as slaves. The British people at some point in history began to advocate for an end to slave trade, and so they started signing treaties with different parts of the African continent to end transatlantic slave trade. So this was what they did with this treaty that was signed by Obadosumo. So British commercial and imperial interests drove the decision. Lagos became a crown colony in 1865 and was governed directly from London. So that was the beginning of direct colonial administration in Nigeria. So after that, the Berlin Conference took place. European powers met in Berlin to divide Africa into colonial territories and to formalize imperial control without African input. So many different European powers came together to discuss how they can divide the African continent among themselves. So Africans were not invited to the table at this time. Britain secured claims to the Niger area through treaties with local chiefs and by establishing the Royal Niger Company. So it was through this company that they were able to move to different parts of the Nigerian society. So they started from Lagos and then spread down south towards Calabar, and then they moved up north to the northern regions within the country. Now let's move on to the next slide. Alright, so there was military conquest just after the Berlin Conference. The British people started to use military force and diplomacy to subdue various regions within the country. They led a military campaign that led to the fall of Ijebu Kingdom in 1892, and by 1893, most of the Yoruba Kingdom signed a treaty with Britain as they saw it as a practical necessity. So after they gotten Lagos, they started moving southwards towards other regions in southern Nigeria. But most of the Yoruba kingdoms decided to sign a treaty instead of taking their people into war, because they knew that it was impossible to defeat these British forces. Eventually, they continued to move downwards towards other territories. They conquered the Benin Kingdom in 1897. The Igbo territories were difficult to conquer as they had no centralized authority. Remember, the Igbo society had no centralized system of administration. There was nobody at the top. They made decisions together. So it was very difficult for the British administration to conquer territories within the eastern region of Nigeria. So by 1902, they conquered these territories as well. So the capture of the Sokoto Caliphate took place in 1903. By the Sokoto Caliphate will mean most of the regions in northern Nigeria. So after that, there was a consolidation of the British authority. By 1900, the Royal Niger Company ceded its territory to the British Crown. So after the Royal Niger Company had been able to gain access to various regions within the Nigerian territory, they were able to cede these territories to the British government, to the British Crown. So they established two protectorates, the Northern Protectorate in 1900 and the Southern Protectorate also in 1900. Then the Lagos colony was separate. The Lagos colony was governed directly and they were governed with British laws. This was regarded as a crown colony. So this has been in existence since 1861 and was not part of any of the protectorates. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, after that there was the amalgamations. So there was the first amalgamation in 1906 where the Lagos colony was merged with Southern Protectorates. So the Lagos colony and the Southern Protectorate came together, they were amalgamated. Then on the 1st of January 1914, Governor General Lord Frederick Lugard amalgamated the Northern and Southern Protectorates to form the Colony and Protectorate of Nigeria. So that was when Nigeria was formed as a country, through the amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorates. So reasons included administrative efficiency and financial necessity, as the North was economically weaker. So these were the reasons why the British administration decided to amalgamate these two different regions in Nigeria. So they felt that they needed to be able to control them indirectly. They introduced the indirect rule soon afterwards. So it helped with administrative efficiency. It also helped to resolve some of the financial troubles they were having with the governing of these various territories. They did not have enough money to directly administer the affairs of the Nigerian society. So they decided to do that through indirect rule. Then the amalgamation was largely administrative. The regions remained socially, culturally, and politically divided. So these different regions that they amalgamated together, they had different cultures, different religion, and so it was very difficult for them to be able to govern them together as a whole. They were still using the indirect rule system, where each of the different societies, each of the different kingdoms were allowed to have their leaders, their centralized leaders, but these leaders answered to the British authority. So this was the system in which they governed these various protectorates. But the problem was that the amalgamation still continues to affect Nigeria to this day. The northern region at the time was economically weaker, and so they were using some of the resources they got from the southern region to govern the entire country. So this was a problem that continues to haunt Nigeria to this day. Now let's move on to the next slide. Now we're going to discuss the Crown Colony system. So the Crown Colony system was a system that was adopted in the Lagos Crown Colony. It was a system of direct administration. It's a form of colonial rule in which a territory was governed directly by the British Crown through appointed officials. So the difference between this Crown Colony system and the indirect rule system is that for the Crown Colony system, the people were governed directly and they were governed using the laws of the colonial masters. But the indirect rule system was governed indirectly via different traditional rulers who were able to implement traditional laws and customs within their land, but had to get policy direction from the British colonial administration. So this system was imposed in British colonies where the local people were considered unfit to govern themselves. So the Lagos Crown Colony was formally established in 1861 when Lagos was annexed by the British Empire. So once Lagos was made a crown colony, it came under the direct administrative rule of the British government. So this is very important because here we begin to see how the laws in Nigeria started to develop. So the first modern laws that were introduced to the Nigerian society were the British laws. The people of Lagos were governed with British laws. So they were punished according to the laws that have been administered by the British society. The British immediately began establishing their legal and administrative systems, including appointing a governor to oversee the colony. So all of the systems that govern the British people were brought into the Nigerian society and were used to govern the Nigerian people. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, what are the features of the direct rule system in the Crown Colonies? So in Crown Colonies, the British government appointed a governor or governor general to oversee the administration. So this governor acted as the highest authority representing the British Crown and implementing British policies. So the colonial governor was representing the British society here in Nigeria. British laws were implemented directly in Crown Colonies and there was no room for traditional laws and customs. So that was what was going on in Lagos. The laws and customs of the Lagos people were set aside and people were governed using the laws of the British people. So courts in Crown Colonies were run by British appointed judges who enforced British law. British military forces were stationed in Crown Colonies to maintain order, and the British administration directly controlled the economic activities within a Crown Colony, including taxation and trade. All of these things were supposed to be governed by a constitution, but at that time, Nigeria did not have a constitution. And so the laws of the British people were being applied in the Nigerian context. So you can see how all of these things are going to eventually influence how things turn out later on as we move on to other points in history, in our Nigerian history. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we're going to discuss the colonial governor and its functions within the Nigerian society. So the colonial governor was appointed by the British monarch on the advice of the colonial office. So there was a colonial office in Britain that helped to govern various colonial territories, both in Africa and some parts of Asia. So the governor served as the supreme authority in the colony and represented the British Crown and oversaw all branches of government. So following are the functions of the colonial governor. First of all, he is the chief executive officer of the colony. He is also the commander-in-chief of the colonial armed forces. He is the head of government and representative of the crown. He is the appointer of officials to various administrative and judicial positions. He is the chairperson of both the executive and legislative councils. He is the controller of finance, overseeing taxation, budgeting, and public expenditure. He also had the power to make laws by proclamation in the absence of a functioning legislative council. So before the legislative council was created later on in history, they were governing the society by proclamations, still according to the dictates of British law. So they exercised veto powers over any legislative proposal deemed contrary to British interests. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right. Eventually, the executive and the legislative councils were introduced. This was introduced by Lord Frederick Lugard, as we're going to discuss later on. So the executive council comprised senior colonial officials such as the colonial secretary, the attorney general, the lieutenant governors, and treasurer. All of the offices were held by British people. So the lieutenant governors were the governors of each of the regions. This council served as advisors to the governor on matters of administration, but the governor had the power to accept or reject such advice. So this is also very important, as we'll see later on. These powers that were held by the governor was referred to as veto or reserve powers. It's very important to note because in a democratic society, you're not supposed to have a governor like this. So as we began to develop constitutionally, we'll see how some of these veto reserve power was gradually taken away from this particular office and spread across various branches of government. So the Executive Council also had no independent power. They acted in an advisory capacity and carried out the governor's directives. The Legislative Council was made up entirely of British officials, including the colonial governor. They are responsible for making laws for the colony, and they were dominated by the governor, who had veto power over all decisions. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so eventually educated elites began to erupt within the Nigerian society. Some of the Nigerians that were educated within the society were sent to Britain to have further education, and then when they came back with that need to become part of the governing body within the African society. And so when they saw the system that was implemented within the Lagos Crown Colony and in other protectorates, they began criticizing the colonial government at the time. So this system was widely criticized, particularly by the emerging class of Western educated Africans in cities like Lagos and Calabar. So these were their main grievances. One of them was the lack of representation. The legislative and executive councils were mostly made up of European officials with no obligation to consult Africans. So Africans had no real voice in such a system. We're going to discover how the legislative and the executive councils had no African representation at all. So the Africans had no say in the laws that were made in society and the policies that were implemented in the various regions within the Nigerian society. There was also the disregard for traditional institutions. The governor's absolute power left no room for public consultation or democratic processes. Laws were passed and taxes imposed without African consent. So the traditional institutions were disregarded at the time. Remember, in the pre-colonial era, the emirs, the obas, and other traditional rulers within African society had absolute power. They had the power to govern the society according to the customs of the people. But in the Crown Colony system, the traditional rulers were stripped of most of their power. They had to receive policy direction from the British colonial administration. Another reason why the Crown Colony system was not popular among the educated elites was the nomination process. Africans who were members of the Legislative Council later on were nominated instead of elected. So this led to the appointment of illegitimate representations for Africans. So some of these traditional rulers that were part of the Legislative and the Executive Council later on in history were people that were nominated by the British colonial government. These people that were nominated were loyal to the British Crown, and so they were not fully representing the interests of the African people. And that reason why this system was unpopular was authoritarian rule. The governor's absolute power left no room for public consultation or democratic processes. Laws were passed and taxes imposed without the consent of the Africans. So there was a form of authoritarian rule within this system. This was until a constitution was developed later on in the Nigerian history. So there is also the exclusion of educated elites. The educated elites who were competent enough to represent the African population were excluded from the administration of the Crown Colony. So we talked about how these people went abroad to study, and they came back and they were very knowledgeable about the democratic system and some of those principles that are associated with a democratic system. But they were not given the opportunity to practicalize this system within the African society. They were not allowed any form of representation within the government. So the exclusion of these educated elites also made the system unpopular. There was also racial discrimination. Colonial policies favored Europeans in employment, education, and legal matters. Africans, no matter how educated, were rarely appointed to meaningful positions. So most of these people that actually came back to the country, they were not given any major position within the society, both in governments and in the various sectors of the economy. So this discrimination too was frowned upon by the educated elites. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to discuss the Nigerian Council. So the Nigerian Council was the first council that was developed in Nigeria. So this occurred after the amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorate in 1914. So it was intended to serve as a consultative body. Lugard believed it would give the appearance of unity and cohesiveness in the new amalgamated Nigeria. So it was a consultative body. It was not a body that actually made the laws or implemented policies. They were just playing out a consultative role. They gave advice to the colonial government, and the colonial government can either choose to accept or reject such advice. So the Nigerian Council consisted of 36 members in total. So they had 24 official and 12 unofficial members. Of the 12 unofficial members, 6 were European and other 6 were Africans. So we can say that of the 36 members in the Nigerian Council, only 6 of them were Africans. So the 6 Africans included the Sultan of Sokoto, the Emir of Kano, the Oba of Benin, the Alaafin of Oyo, and some other people representing the eastern region in Nigeria. So in practice, Lugard used the annual sessions to inform the traditional rulers of British policy, leaving them with no function at the council meeting except to listen and to assent. So we can see that in this sense, the Nigerian Council was just designed for the traditional rulers to listen to policy directions and to go back to their communities to implement the policies that have been made by the colonial administration. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we are going to discuss the National Congress of British West Africa, the NCBWA. This was a very important congress that helped to shape the constitutional developments within the African society. So the National Congress of British West Africa was established in Accra, Gold Coast, which is now known as Ghana, in 1920 as the first major pan-West African nationalist organization. So it was created by Joseph Casely Hayford of Gold Coast and Dr. Akinwade Savage of Nigeria, and consisted of educated elites from British West African colonies. So if you want to learn more about the NCBWA, you can go back to our previous lesson on the process of decolonization and nationalism in Nigeria. So now we're going to discuss the delegation to London. In 1920, the NCBWA sent a delegation to London to meet the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord Alfred Milner, to present a petition demanding the introduction of the elective principle and other democratic reforms. So we talked about how the Crown colony system was unpopular among educated elites, and the indirect rule system as well. So the NCBWA was a representative of the educated elites. They wanted to air their grievances to the British colonial authority, and so they decided to send a delegation to London at this time. So the petition demanded for the election of African representatives to legislative councils in all British West African territories. They advocated for the establishment of a university for British West Africa, for reforms in the judicial system to ensure fair trials for Africans. This is very important because at that time, the laws that were being implemented in society were not favoring the African people. So they wanted a reform in the judicial system. They also advocated for the protection of customary land tenure systems. So it's also important to note that at that time, there was a lot of land tenure issues within that society. Some of the lands that originally belonged to African people were being taken away by the British authorities. And so many of these cases were in the courts at the time, and the Africans were not being favored by the courts. So some of them were losing their lands to the British authorities. So this was one of the petitions that the NCWA made. They also advocated for the expansion of education and public services. So by public services, we mean social amenities, infrastructure, education, and so many other things that are needed in a society. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, we are going to discuss Milner's response. After this delegation went to London to present this petition to the Secretary of State for the Colonies at the time, which was Alfred Milner, Milner rejected the NCBWA's demands outright. His reasoning included his distrust of educated Africans. So Milner viewed the educated African elite as detached from the majority of the African population, whom he considered primitive. So he talked about how these educated elites were just a few of the African people. They were not adequately representing the African population, who at that time were not educated. The Africans at the time were still governed by their traditional rulers, although these traditional rulers were receiving policy direction from British authority. So at that time, the educated elites were not able to adequately represent the interests of a majority of people within the African society. There was also the belief in indirect rule. So Milner and the Colonial Office favored Lord Lugard's policy of indirect rule, and they were not willing to change that for something else. So he dismissed the delegates as self-interested intellectuals who did not represent the common African people. So he's quoted as referring to them as a microscopic minority of Europeanized Africans and politically immature. However, in 1921, Winston Churchill succeeded Milner as Secretary of State for the Colonies. So Churchill adopted a more progressive stance towards colonial reform in response to increasing agitation from African elites and the changing global political climate following World War I. So after World War I, so many of these countries in the West, especially the British, the French, and the German people, they were being criticized for their imperialist stance towards their relationship with other countries of the world. So they believed they were imperial authorities. So this word had a very negative connotation at the time. And so Churchill and so many other British authorities were trying to ensure that this public image of the British people began to dissipate. So as a result of that, they decided to introduce the elective principle within so many different African societies at that time. So Churchill recognized the need to experiment with limited political participation so that they can gradually advance towards independence at that time. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so we're going to discuss the implementation of the elective principle in Nigeria. The Clifford Constitution, named after Governor Sir Hugh Clifford, introduced the elective principle in Nigeria. So a legislative council for the colonial and protectorate of southern Nigeria was introduced. There was also the elective principle for the first time. 4 members were to be elected by adult male taxpayers in Lagos. So 3 members in Lagos and 1 in Calabar. They also introduced the qualification to vote. So this ability to vote was not given to all members of the society. There was what is referred to as the male suffrage and the property suffrage that we've discussed when we're discussing the various voting systems we have. So only a tiny elite, that's male that is over 21 years old, with an annual income of at least £100 and who were literate in English could vote at the time. So all of these things were qualifications for voting. So this means that the ability to vote were restricted to only a few set of people within Lagos and Calabar at the time. And again, this did not represent a large portion of the Nigerian society. Then there was the spread of the elective principle to other British West African territories. So following Nigeria's lead, the elective principle was gradually introduced into other British West African colonies. So in the Gold Coast, by 1925, limited elections were allowed for African members of the Legislative Council. In Sierra Leone, by the late 1920s, franchise was limited to elite Africans in urban areas. And in the Gambia, electoral representation was introduced in the 1930s, but suffrage was restricted to a small elite. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, now we're going to move on to the Clifford Constitution of 1922. This was the first constitution in Nigeria. The Clifford Constitution was introduced during the governorship of Sir Hugh Clifford, who succeeded Lord Frederick Lugard as governor of Nigeria in 1919. So he was in that position from 1919 to 1925. So several factors led to the need for a new constitution in Nigeria. One of them is the criticism of Lord Lugard's Nigerian Council. So it was seen as unrepresentative and dominated by official or appointed members. So this was one of the criticisms of the educated elites in Nigeria. They believed that it wasn't representing the African people as they claimed it to be. because it was only dominated by official members, and then the unofficial members who were there were only there to receive policy direction. They were not allowed to make decisions on behalf of the African people. So there was also the growth of Nigerian nationalism, especially among the educated elites in Lagos and Calabar. We talked about how people like Sir Herbert Macaulay and Joseph Casely Hayford of the Gold Coast were coming up. These educated elites were beginning to advocate for reforms within the Nigerian society. And so the growth of this nationalism within the society also influenced the creation of this constitution. There was also the pressure from the NCBWA and the agitation for the elective principle and African participation in governance. And then also Winston Churchill's more liberal colonial policies as the Secretary of State for the colonies. So all of these things influenced the creation of the Clifford Constitution. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, so what are the key features of the Clifford Constitution? One of the features is the Legislative Council for Southern Nigeria. A new Legislative Council was established exclusively for Southern Nigeria. So it consisted of 46 members in total. 27 of them were official members and they were colonial administrators. That means that they were European officials who had economic interest within that council. Then there were 19 unofficial members, including 9 Europeans who were mainly representatives of commercial interest, and 10 Africans. Out of these 10 Africans, 4 of them were elected. These were the ones that were elected using the elective principle that was introduced. So 3 of them were elected from Lagos and 1 from Calabar. And then 6 of them were appointed by the governor to represent other parts of the country. So these 6 were appointed. They were appointed by the British Colonial Administration for other parts of the country where the elective principle has not been introduced. So in this sense, you can see that the elective principle allowed for the election of 4 people out of the 46 members of the Legislative Council. Now let's move on to the next slide. All right, and that feature of the Clifford Constitution is the introduction of the elective principle. So for the first time in Nigerian history, Africans were allowed to elect representatives into a legislative body. The elective principle was applied only in Lagos and Calabar, where there was a significant presence of educated elites. So the voting rights were restricted to males aged 21 and above, to those who were literate in English, and to those who earned at least £100 annually, which was a very high income at the time. It was also restricted to those resident in Lagos or Calabar for at least 12 months. So males who adhered to all of these restrictions were allowed to vote at the time. So we've come to the end of the first segment of this first part of the video lesson. So if you like this content, please, you can continue on this journey with us by going down to the link in the description below. This takes you to my school website where you can subscribe for the government topic by topic video lesson. There you can continue on this journey with us. So we are going to move on to other key features of the Clifford Constitution. We are going to discuss the achievements and the weaknesses of the Clifford Constitution, and then we are going to move on to the Richard's Constitution. I hope to see you there. I believe you're enjoying this content. If yes, please don't forget to hit the like button, click on the subscribe button, and lastly, tap on the notification bell to get informed as soon as we release the next videos.